The Sonic Racing series has a long and fascinating history. In 1994, Sonic Drift was released for the Sega Game Gear and was intended to be Sega's answer to the immensely popular Super Mario Kart. At the time, the character lineup was still relatively small, and the game was only released in Japan. Over the years, however, the series continued to evolve. The first title with the Sonic Racing branding was Sonic and Sega All-Stars Racing, which later gained even more content in its transformed sequel. It was released in 2012, and the game's defining feature was its transformation mechanic. Vehicles dynamically adapted to the track, turning into boats during water sections, or airplanes during sky sections. This made the gameplay very dynamic, and to me the game especially stood out for its excellent track design. The newest entry in the series is Sonic Racing Crossworlds. The game was first announced in early 2025, and was released later that year in September. The main selling point of the game was without a doubt its crossworld mechanic. Instead of using the traditional system of racing 3 laps on a single track, the game allows players to switch to a completely different course after the first lap. A normal race therefore still consists of 3 laps, but the second lap takes place on an entirely different track. This introduces a new dynamic to races, as players can influence how it will continue. The system works like this. At the end of the first lap, 2 giant teleportation rings appear on the track. The player who is in first place at that moment gets to decide which destination everyone will be teleported to. This choice is strategically important because each available track presents its own unique challenges. At the same time, this mechanic ensures that no 2 races feel exactly alike, keeping the gameplay fresh and exciting. But even so, the feature received mixed reactions. While some players praised the dynamic gameplay, others felt the system was a bit too chaotic, and criticized that too much luck was involved. Personally, I can understand the criticism, but I think it's a cool feature and it helps make every race feel unique. However, the term crossworld has another meaning in this game too. Sonic Racing Crossworlds is not only defined by its interesting approach to track design, but also by its very unique character lineup. While most characters come from the Sonic universe, some originate from completely different franchises. Sega had a big ambition with this game. They wanted to bring many different series together and have the characters compete against another. This is actually nothing new for the game series. In Sonic and All-Stars Racing Transformed, for example, several guest characters from other game series already appeared, such as Ai from Super Monkey Ball and Amigo from Samba de Amigo. In Crossworlds, however, Sega aimed for even bigger collaborations. As a result, characters and content from franchises such as Spongebob and Minecraft appeared in the game too. These collaborations were extremely well received, and the announcements of the guest characters gained a lot of attention before launch. What's especially cool is that these collaborations don't just add new characters, they also introduce tracks based on those franchises. The Minecraft track in particular is genuinely impressive, and it's obvious that a lot of time and effort went into it. The collaborations therefore do not feel like simple cash grabs, but more like a meaningful addition to the game's roster and track selection. There is one aspect I dislike, however. Some of the guest characters aren't fully voiced. If you choose to play as characters like Joker or Ichiban, it feels quite strange to play as a silent driver, especially considering that Sega themselves own the rights to those franchises. So it feels a little odd, but it doesn't really ruin the concept. Another feature I really like is the ability to customize vehicles with passive effects that complement your preferred playstyle, allowing everyone to approach the game in their own way. Sonic Racing Crossworlds was well received by both critics and players, which was especially encouraging after the somewhat underwhelming Team Sonic Racing. The unfortunate part, however, is that despite its many positive qualities, Crossworlds was not a major commercial success. In fact, it may be the opposite. While the game sold around 1 million copies within its first month, and therefore had a solid launch, Sega announced earlier this year that it had failed to meet its sales target. Fans hoped that the situation would improve over time, but in June of this year, Sega once again stated that Crossworlds was continuing to perform below expectations. There seem to be several reasons for this. The most significant was likely the release timing. The game launched in September 2025, only a few months after Mario Kart World, and shortly before Kirby Air Riders. Many racing game fans were therefore already occupied with other titles, causing Crossworlds to be somewhat overlooked towards the end of the year. There are of course also fans of fun racers on other platforms, but thanks to the enormous popularity of Mario Kart, most players interested in that genre are likely to be on Nintendo systems. It is almost impressive that Sega chose to release the game in the 1 year that Mario Kart World launched, the long-awaited successor to the most successful franchise in a genre, after more than a decade. The timing couldn't have been worse. In addition, I felt that discussions about the game were often dominated by pointless comparisons between the two game series, which prevented Crossworlds from standing on its own. It would not surprise me if many people dismissed it from the very beginning as a cheap Mario Kart knockoff without ever giving it a fair chance. And that's a real shame, because Crossworlds is genuinely a very good game with an identity of its own. Although in hindsight, it is admittedly quite amusing to look back at all those videos from people claiming that the game would destroy Mario Kart. The second major issue was the high price. At $70, the game launched at a high price point, and I often saw people online arguing that it was simply too expensive for many fans. While the game did have an interesting character lineup and the innovative crossworld mechanic, I personally don't think the game contained enough content to fully justify the asking price. Especially when it comes to single player content, it definitely needed more, so I can understand why many people felt that way. On top of that, $70 was not necessarily even the final price. Players also had the option of purchasing a $30 season pass, which quickly pushed the total cost of the game to $100 if they wanted to access the characters and tracks from Minecraft, Spongebob and the other franchises. And since that is kind of the core concept of the game, the merging of different worlds, this was likely the feature many people were interested in the most. It is also worth mentioning that all of this additional content was announced before launch and was available through a day one season pass, something that was often heavily criticized. So some people probably viewed it as a $100 game, rather than a $70 one. And even that $100 investment will not be the end for some people, as Sega has already announced a second season pass, containing 6 additional DLC packs. That may make it sound like I'm against these DLCs, but it's actually quite the opposite. I always enjoy seeing different worlds collide in a game, whether it's in Smash, Fortnite or in Sonic Racing Crossworlds. I always find that concept to be very appealing. The problem is simply that it makes the already expensive launch price even harder to justify. I think the game would have appealed to significantly more people if it had launched at $50 and had not been accompanied by so many DLC announcements before it had even launched. That would have lowered the barrier to entry considerably and made it much easier for players to justify purchasing the DLCs later on. Even now, almost a year after release, the game is still priced at $70, suggesting that Sega has no intention of changing its strategy. You can sometimes find it discounted to about $20 to $30, and for that price I definitely recommend it. Crossworlds currently has about 500 to 1000 active players on Steam. However, it is also available on other platforms and supports crossplay. So I don't think the game is at risk of dying out, but the community will probably stay rather small outside of DLC releases. Sega has also stated that due to the disappointing sales of Crossworlds, it plans to adopt a new marketing strategy. In the future, the company intends to rely more heavily on influencer marketing to promote its game series. Whether that will be successful though, we'll have to see. It is also possible that Sega's expectations were simply too high. With the Crossworlds concept, the company likely hoped to attract a much broader audience. Announcements of characters such as Joker and Miku generated enormous attention online, and the same thing is now happening with the reveal of Season Pass 2. People often discussed which characters they would like to see added to Crossworlds, giving the game a surprisingly strong online presence. However, that attention does not seem to have translated into sales, suggesting that Sega may have misjudged how many people would actually care about it. In the end, I believe Sonic Racing Crossworlds deserved better. The core concept is fun, the crossover content is cool, and it is genuinely a very good fun racer. Unfortunately, the high launch price and poor release timing ultimately caused the game to be overshadowed last year and prevented it from reaching a larger audience. But who knows, perhaps the new DLCs and hopefully some price reductions will finally give the game the recognition it has deserved all along.